My name is Julianna. I am a park ranger with the National Park Service at Amache National Historic Site over in Grenada, Colorado, spitting distance from Kansas. And I'm gonna talk to you a little bit about Amache, what we are, what we're doing. But real quick, I'd like to get just a pulse on how much we feel like we know about Japanese American incarceration during World War II. So I can just get like a show of hands if you want, like, 1, I don't know anything. 2, you've heard of it before. 3, if you kind of know of the basic story. 4, you're familiar with it. And 5, if you are an expert.
3.
Should we vote?
Maybe 4. All right. Right on. Cool. No 5, so I don't have to leave. I'll let you go. So a lot of times when we talk about Japanese American incarceration, the story starts here. If y'all are familiar with this?
Yeah.
Right, this is Pearl Harbor. This is where the story starts a lot of time. But I think that actually does a disservice to the story, and I want to throw it back a little further.
Was that Amache?
Amache?
No, Amazon. The ship that went down.
The Arizona.
It was Arizona.
Arizona, yes.
Okay, thank you.
No problem. Yeah. So going back a little bit further, in the late 1800s, that's when the Japanese begin immigrating into the US. Japan lists its period of self-isolation, and you start to see people leaving Japan. Then in 1870, the US passes the Naturalization Act of 1870. Notably, this means that African Americans can now become US citizens. They had been barred from citizenship before. But Asian immigrants are still excluded from being able to become citizens, and this is largely aimed at Chinese immigrants at this time. And then fast forwarding a little bit more, in 1924, the US passes the Immigration Act of 1924, which prohibits people not eligible for citizenship in the Naturalization Act from entering the country. This is also known as the Asian Exclusion Act. So, real quick note, approximately 1/3 of people who were incarcerated during this period of time, during World War II, approximately 1/3 of them were Japanese immigrants. But because of the Immigration Act of 1924, that means all of them had been in the country for a couple of decades, if not longer. And they were not able to become naturalized citizens because of these policies. At the same time, there are also states enacting laws that are preventing Japanese immigrants from being able to buy land. California was kind of the main one, but a lot of other states also followed suit. Despite that, a lot of the Japanese immigrants are still coming to the US and really living out that American dream. They are creating businesses, farms, being very profitable, and really starting to kind of make a name for themselves. Then we get to Pearl Harbor. So on December 7th, 1941, the Japanese armed forces attack the US fleet at Pearl Harbor. Immediately after that, the FBI began arresting Japanese community leaders for fear that they might be spies. Like, we're talking the next day, if you were a prominent figure in the Japanese American community, there's a good chance FBI is knocking on your door and taking you away. Some of these people would be separated from their families for the duration of World War II. And then 2 months later, 83 years ago today, on February 19th, 1942, President FDR signs Executive Order 9066. Executive Order 9066 allows military commanders to create military zones from which civilians can be excluded. And this specific order did not actually specify any sort of ethnic group, but the curfews and evacuation orders that followed were specifically aimed at Japanese Americans. They did not list anyone else. I'll show a map in a little bit, but the military exclusion zone essentially was all of California, the western parts of Oregon and Washington, and then the very southern tip of Arizona. About a month later, there would be another executive order in March that created the War Relocation Authority. And the War Relocation Authority is who oversaw the removal and incarceration of Japanese Americans in the West Coast. So then by spring of 1942, we're thinking like April-ish, you start to see orders like this posted in Japanese American neighborhoods. Bainbridge Island in Washington was the first community that was forced to leave their homes, and they were sent to Manzanar in California. People were given 1 to 2 weeks to pack up anything they could. Whatever they couldn't pack, they had to sell, or they had to find someone to take care of it. They were only allowed to bring what they could carry, so that's 1 to 2 suitcases. And then you can see on some of the bags in that photo, little tags on there. Those were just identification numbers. So every person was given an identification number, and that's how you tracked baggage, essentially reducing them to just a number. One thing I'd really like to call out in that exclusion, or in those evacuation notices, it says it's both alien and non-alien. What is a non-alien? Right, it's a US citizen. Do you think the American public would have acted differently if they said citizens are being rounded up? I mean, there was still a lot of like racial tension, so I don't know that it would have made a difference, but it's something interesting to think about. While we're on the topic of language, I do want to kind of make a brief statement about what we call these sites. A lot of times we hear them referred to as internment camps. An internment is an actual legal process where civilians of enemy nations are placed in confinement during wartime. There were legitimate internment camps. Amache was not one of them. They were usually run by the Army or the Department of Justice, not by this War Relocation Authority. So it is more accurate to call places like Amache, Manzanar, Minidoka, either concentration camps or incarceration sites. I tend to use the word incarceration site because concentration camp has the affiliation with the Holocaust. We're not in the business of systematically murdering people. This time at least.
Yeah.
So that darker shaded area is going to be that exclusion zone, and then these are the 10 WRA sites across the United States. And then Amache is the one that is labeled as Grenada there. The reason Amache is in Colorado is because of Governor Ralph Carr. He was incredibly empathetic to the Japanese Americans. He was the only politician to really stand up for Japanese Americans during this time. There was a voluntary evacuation period before the forced removals where he welcomed Japanese Americans to the state of Colorado, saying, you can come here, we will not, we'll protect you, we'll take care of you. Once that was over and they were like, we are removing these people and we need somewhere to build prisons to hold them, he was the only Western governor who actually said that they could come here. Figured if they're gonna do it, they might as well come here, but we're gonna take a little bit better care of them. He said it was the American thing to do, the patriotic thing, the decent thing to do. And then the quote on here is from another speech he gave where he really came to the defense of Japanese Americans. He said, the Japanese are protected by the same constitution that protects us. They have the same rights we have. They are protected by the same court that protects us. If you harm them, you must harm me. I was brought up in a small town where I knew the shame and dishonor of race hatred. I grew to despise it because it threatened the happiness of you and you and you. So he's really held in high esteem with our survivor and descendant community. They feel very grateful for his influence.
Was Ralph Carr of any ethnic group himself that he would have felt that way? Or was he just, hey, English or something like that?
As far as I know, He was a European American and just incredibly empathetic.
Okay, thank you.
Side note, if anyone has any questions, just shout them out. Like, you don't have to hold them to the end. So this is an overview of Amache once it's built. Its official name, once again, is the Grenada Relocation Center. It was given the informal name Amache to avoid confusion at the Grenada post office. I don't know if anyone has been to Grenada. It's really small, like 400 or 500 people, and then you have a town that at its peak was 7,500, kind of spring up overnight. Overwhelmed the local post office when people are just writing Grenada, Colorado. So they started calling it Amache to kind of alleviate some of that confusion. The name comes from a Cheyenne woman, Amache Ochini Prowers. She was the daughter of a Cheyenne chief who was murdered at Sand Creek. And her husband was John Prowers, who Prowers County is named after, and a very successful businessman and a rancher in the area. Of the, oh goodness gracious, went too fast. Of the 10 WRA sites, Amache was actually the smallest. It had, like I said, 7,500-ish people at its peak. About 10,000 people passed through over the 3 years it operated. 2/3 of those, once again, were American citizens by birthright. There were about 30 blocks of buildings at Amache. Each block had a single mess hall, a communal bathhouse, 12 barracks surrounding those buildings, and then a recreation hall. Each barrack had 6 apartments that housed anywhere from 1 to 8 people. So I'm really bad at math, but I think that rounds out to about 300-ish per block if they were full. Can't find the mouse to scroll down on the rest of my notes, so we're gonna hope that I covered everything. When people first arrived, you're gonna see that in the top left-hand photo. Walls were bare. They were provided a army cot and mattress, a single light bulb, and a coal-burning stove. Any furniture that they wanted to have, they had to build themselves through liberated materials. So that's usually stuff that they took from, that was left over from the building of the site. The rooms had no insulation. They are straight up just like wood, tar paper, that's it. A lot of the wood was green when it was built, or when the barracks were built. So as that dried out, it created gaps. And as I'm sure you all know, it's really windy out here. It's really dusty. It's cold. All of that just blew right in. Then below that, you have the kind of cafeteria style mess halls. That's where all of your meals were served. This was really disruptive for a lot of the families who, like the family unit's very important in Japanese culture, but then you had a lot of the young kids in particular wanting to eat with their friends. They don't have that family structure anymore. So the mess halls were really disruptive for that. They also were still operating under wartime rations, and they were serving a lot of weird food for the Japanese Americans, at least. We get a lot of notes from survivors about how bad the food was. It's a very visceral memory for a lot of people. And then the other photo, that's actually a photo from the recreation at Manzanar of what the bathhouse, latrines, whatever you want to call them, might have looked like. We don't have any good images. People weren't taking photos in the bathroom, shocker. I haven't seen any blueprints. Like, we don't fully know what the ones at Amache looked like. We know they didn't look like this, but it still kind of gives you the concept of that lack of privacy. Once again, very, very disruptive for this community, especially the Issei, who are those first generations, the Japanese immigrants, value a lot of privacy. This was really difficult for them. There are stories of Issei women waiting till like the middle of the night to go take showers to use the bathroom, so they would just try to have a little bit of privacy. Eventually there were some partitions that were built by the incarcerees, but that was all driven by them. Now, despite all of these like really harsh conditions that they're living in, They really tried hard to create a sense of normalcy wherever they could. There were a lot of gardens built in Amache. We have some really spectacular garden remains that you can see around the barracks. They participated in Boy Scouts, they played sports, they actually played Holly. Holly is the only school that came to Amache to play football at Amache. Amache won, so they were undefeated on their home field. And then they had like traditional ceremonies. So I think one of the coolest things about this community is how they really embraced both being American and Japanese. They did not say, just because you put us in these camps because we look like the enemy, we're not going to forego our heritage. We see a lot of Japanese influence in the gardens. This ceremony that I've got a photo of, something called Oban, which sounds very similar to like the Day of the Dead kind of ceremony, but like a way to honor relatives who have passed on, and yeah, just really kind of leaning into being Japanese American. And then they also participated in the war effort, just like the rest of the United States. Agriculture was huge. The residential area of Amache, which is what makes up the park today, is about 1 square mile. The entirety of the property was like 10,000 acres, and that was pretty much all agricultural land. They produced so much produce that it was shipped off both to other incarceration sites to supplement that. It supplemented their own diet and their own wartime rations, and some were even sent to the army. Then the photo to the right of that is some of the silkscreen printing shop. Amache was the only camp that had a successful silkscreen printing shop. They produced posters for the wartime effort. It was training materials for the US Navy, but then they've also produced stuff for the camp, whether it was like invitations to dances or I've got an image over here in this case that was the cover of the welcome booklet that people received when they showed up to Amache. In the lower left, we have, or actually both of the two lower images are speaking to the actual military service of the folks at Amache as well. In January of 1943, the US War Department announced the formation of a segregated unit of the military specifically for Japanese Americans. That was the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. It was made up of second generation Japanese American volunteers from Hawaii and the continental US. There were 953 people from Amache who volunteered to go into military service, whether that was with the 442, the Women's Army Corps, military intelligence, and a few other branches. It was about 10% of the camp, which was the largest percentage of any of the 10 sites. Ultimately, there were 32, one of the two, men who lost their lives in World War II, fighting while their friends and family were held in concentration camps. One actually received the Medal of Honor as well.
32?
I believe so. I have it written in here, but I can't find my cursor. Double check.
So the people are incarcerated because they're considered a threat, but then they let them join the military?
Yep.
Isn't that?
Yep.
Okay.
They did pretty much exclusively fight in the European theater. European theater. But then you did have the military intelligence who was helping decode, Japanese transmissions. So make it make sense.
It's hard to,
right?
'Cause, yeah.
When you think about the amount of money that was spent on these incarceration sites during World War II and all of the other war efforts and rationing, it really is, it doesn't make any sense.
We did the same thing. Internment.
Yeah. And then Amache finally closed its doors in October of 1945. The people who were still there were given $25 and a train ticket to a destination of their choosing. Some people chose to find a new place to live and start a new life. A lot of people went to Denver from Amache. There's a really large Japanese American population in Denver still, because of the voluntary evacuation prior to this, and then also the people leaving and heading to Denver. A lot of other people chose to go back to California. But regardless of their choice, almost everyone lost everything that they had. A lot of those Issei, those first generation who had spent years building up some sort of wealth, felt that they were now too old to start over. A lot of them fell into kind of depressions. Almost none of them talked about their experience, and that goes for the Issei and everyone as well. There's a really long period of time where people just tried to move on and didn't talk about what they went through. On-site, buildings were auctioned off or demolished, and then the site itself was bought by the town of Grenada for the water rights. The wells that were drilled to provide the camp with water I'll still provide the town of Grenada with water. And then after a few decades of dealing with this, you've got the third generation now that was either very young during camp or was born after, and they're starting to learn about this, and they're the civil rights movement is happening, and they get inspired and start a period of redress. And then in 1988, the US government issued an official apology and reparations to survivors. The reparations were only $20,000 though, and it was only to survivors who were still alive, not their children or anything like that.
Yes.
Yes?
Who's the gentleman in the picture?
The white man is Lindley, James Lindley, I believe, who was the director of the camp. And I don't recall the name of the Japanese man, but he was the last person to leave.
So, thank you.
Goodness gracious. So in that apology that was issued in 1988, the government pointed to 3 central failures on the government that allowed for this incarceration to happen. And it was racial prejudice, wartime hysteria, and a failure of political leadership. Fast forward to 2024, and Amache was declared part of the National Park Service. We were actually designated in March of 22 when President Biden signed the Amache National Historic Act into law. It took about 2 years for the land to transfer ownership from the town of Grenada over to the National Park Service, and then we were officially established on February 15th of 2024. So we just had our first birthday on Saturday. We are the 4th of the 10 WRA sites to be added to the National Park Service. You might be thinking, if you already had 3 of them, why are you adding another? In short, each site is different. It tells a different story. We have similarities, but just like you would not expect one site to represent the history of slavery, of the civil rights movement, the American Revolution, any other big chapters in American history, we can't really expect one of these sites to tell the full story as well. One of the coolest things about Amache, and as far as I know, no other site is like this, our barracks were built on concrete foundations, and most of them are still intact and visible. So when we have survivors and descendants come back, we can actually lead them directly to their family's barrack. Be like, this is where your mother, your grandmother, your aunt, whatever it is, this is where they lived for 3 years during World War II. It's a really tangible and powerful connection for the community, and some survivors will recall very little because at this point they were all really young while they were at Amache. But then they come back to this physical location, they see those foundations, they kind of see the surrounding, and start having memories just coming back, which is a really neat experience to be able to facilitate. And then lastly, we would not be here as a national park if it weren't for the decades of stewardship that went into the site before we were really ever in the picture. For the last 30 years, the Amache Preservation Society has been the one taking care of the site. They also maintain the Amache Museum in Grenada, which is where my office is located. It was established by John Hopper, who is a social studies teacher, and he's now the Dean of Students at Grenada High School. And it consists of volunteer students from the school. So it was high school students taking care of this place for the last 30 years. It started off as a classroom project, and now it's a national park. And then we also have a partnership with the Denver University Amache Research Project. It's now the Amache Community Archaeology Project. They've been hosting archaeological field schools at the site since 2008, and they come out every 2 years to do digs. I think almost every block on site has been at least surveyed, and quite a few of them have been excavated as well. So we have this really great knowledge archaeologically of the site and what was happening and what was going on as well. Some of the research that's been done has determined the way the gardeners were able to amend the soil to make it more hospitable to grow plants and stuff like that. Something we'd never know unless you had scientists out on site looking at it and doing that kind of research. And then lastly, we have an incredible survivor and descendant community who has been very vocal advocates for this site since the 70s. This May, we're coming up on our 50th pilgrimage. So every May for the last 50 years, survivors and descendants have been coming back to Amache to pay tribute, both to the people who did not make it out of camp and those that did. So with that, if you'd like some additional resources, I've got a few here. We're also on Facebook. I try to share out stories at least once a week as best I can. If y'all have any questions,
Could we get a printout of that to take home?
no, but I can get something sent out over here for you to,
Okay,
yeah.
Is it
thank
on
you,
your
because
on
that
your
looks like a
brochure?
great way.
Some of it is, if not, I will send this to you,
Okay,
if that's helpful.
yeah.
Alright.
Is there an existing cemetery?
There is, yes. So the cemetery, I don't know why I don't, actually, this is the cemetery in this photo. So there's about 7 grave sites left. A lot of people were cremated and then their remains were taken back with them. Like I said, there are still 7 people buried at the cemetery. And then this is a monument that pays tribute, I think it's put in the 70s, to specifically the folks who gave their lives during World War II, but then also just everyone who was at Amache. And then there's a building that's got another monument that was put in as the camp was closing in 1945 that does a similar thing, pays tribute to everyone who lived there and went through this experience. Yes?
You said that it was the highest number or the highest percentage
Mhm.
of people that from this camp that enlisted
Yes.
into the military. Do you have any speculation on why that might be?
Not entirely. There is some thought that the parts of California that people, because everyone who was at Amache came from California, and the parts of California they came from tended to be a little more conservative. So there's some thoughts that might have played into it. I also think that people were treated pretty well at Amache versus like Tule Lake and Manzanar and Topaz, where we know there were people killed by the guards. Nothing like that ever happened here, so I think maybe there was a little bit more of a feeling of,
Patriotism
yeah.
still manages to exist in that environment.
So I personally don't know that I could do it, so like all the power to them. I think I'm a little too spiteful.
Was it surrounded by fences and all that, like a prison?
Yes, it was barbed wire. It was had guard towers sporadically around it.
Just to keep a man not out.
Yes, and those guard towers were manned by armed guards. They're German shepherds. That being said, after I think about a year, a lot of those guard towers were no longer armed because they realized that these people weren't a threat. But one of our reconstructed buildings on site that you're to visit, you know, maybe when it warms up a little bit, we do have a reconstructed guard tower there.
Hand grenade?
Yes.
Sorry.
How many buildings have been put up?
So we
I know
have,
two last time I went.
yeah, so there's a reconstructed barrack. There is a partially original rec hall. We have the reconstructed guard tower, and then there is a water tower that is actually the original tank that has been restored to the site.
Where are you from?
South Carolina. Not anywhere close by.
Welcome to Southeast Colorado, right?
Live your knowledge. Live your knowledge.
Yes.
Since those buildings were poorly constructed and not insulated well and drafty,
Mhm.
was there kind of a high death rate among those people, you know, during the winter and catching pneumonia and that sort of thing?
Officially, there were 120 deaths over the 3 years.
Oh, wow.
That being said, the number is probably actually a little closer to 140 if it stopped counting stillbirths. Amache did have a hospital, so I think that helped to some extent. You had your hand.
Is the pilgrimage that's coming up in May,
Mhm.
is that open to the public or is it just for them?
It's open to the public,
Okay.
and you can go to amache.org, and there's like some information on that, and when like the registration and stuff gets put up, it'll all be on there.
Okay.
Oh, I was wondering about hers. What's the pilgrimage? Is there in Grenada or what? Like once
yeah.
a year, kind of.
Yeah, so it's in Grenada. It kind of alternates between like the high school and on site for various things, and then it's almost like a big family reunion. Everyone's kind of coming back
I
and
thought
like
we were a
paying
small
tribute.
town.
Yeah, it's one of the coolest things I've done with the National Park Service, is being a part of that pilgrimage.
Interesting. Thank you. Just had to ask.
Yeah.
It's interesting going out there and reading all the plaques that are there, because they had a grocery store. I mean, they made this their own community.
It was a fully functional town.
It was a fully functional town.
It was the 10th largest population center in Colorado at the time, and it was more densely populated than New York City, and it just, at the time, sprang up overnight in rural Colorado.
And from what I understood, and I'll go with what Tom said, they were treated so well, and they made it the best it could be with the gardens and all that. They really didn't blame anybody,
So
per
there,
se, but they made the best with what they had.
yeah, there is this concept of gaman that we hear a lot of survivors and descendants talk about in reference to this, and it comes from Buddhism, I believe, but it means to bear the unbearable with dignity. And that is, yeah, I think how a lot of people survive. They're like, these are, you know, the cards we've been dealt. We're gonna do what we have to do to get through this.
And what did you call that? Gaman?
Gaman, G-A-M-A-N. We also see some incredible artwork that came out of Amache, and I think a lot of that is because of this gaman idea, and it's a way to channel frustrations, feelings, keep busy, so you're kind of not dealing with the feelings of being in a prison.
Fill your root.
Oh, yes. So speaking of artwork, I brought this from the museum. This is a vase that was created by an incarceree made out of yucca root. So, like I said, a lot of the art that came from Amache was through found foraged materials. They realized yuccas have big, thick, woody roots. They dug them up, and there are at least a couple of vases that look like this that I've seen in photos. I think this is the only one we have at the museum. But then we've also got a descendant who has this really incredible yucca root sculpture at his home in California that he's shown me photos of, that his family brought back. We've got, there is a temporary exhibit at the Denver Art Museum. So if y'all are in Denver between now and the beginning of June, in their like Western American art exhibit, a little room for Tokyo Oyama, who was a classically trained artist who was incarcerated at Amache. And it is absolutely stunning. Highly recommend. It's a really, really cool exhibit, and just to see, the beauty that people created in this
Is
really
any of
tragic
that
period
on
of
your
history.
site? Are any of those pictures of his artwork?
There
on
are
your
a
site?
couple at the museum, and then we've also got a bunch of artwork from an artist whose name Fukio Kusumi. We have a lot of his work
In the museum there?
in the museum at
Do you-
Amache.
Are there any on the website? Any pictures of that stuff?
There might be some on Amache Preservation Societies. We have a Mellon Fellow that we're working with that is writing an article right now for us about artwork at Amache. So that will be up on our website hopefully soon.
You mentioned having the sports teams, and they had at least one team that would play with them that weren't
Yeah.
part of the camp. Was there community engagement at all with these people? Was it difficult to
This
do that?
is actually super cool, and I didn't put it in this presentation because I wasn't sure how to fit it into like the narrative I was trying to craft.
Sure.
But because the towns or the community surrounded Grenada, it had a really close relationship with the town of Grenada. So people could almost come and go into town as they pleased. There's the Newman's Drug Store, which is a building you can still see, and it was actually just named to Colorado's most endangered places earlier this month. Local business owner had this drugstore, realized he has this, pardon a very terrible pun, but captive audience, and he starts importing sake. We have stories of people going down there to buy, candies and sodas and stuff like that. People from Grenada would come into camp for like movie nights because there's no theater there, but they'd have some like showings in the recreation halls.
Did
And
they
then-
get an allowance to have money to spend?
Yeah, so they had jobs. It was, kind of meager wages. You're looking from like $13 to $18 a month. But they did have money to spend. There was actually a co-op on site as well that had stuff like that. But then also in the town of Grenada, right next to the drugstore, was the Grenada Fish Market. That was actually run by an incarceree. He had a market in LA, used his connections in LA to get sashimi grade fish shipped from California to Colorado. And that was so successful that when the camp closed, he moved to Denver and kept doing it there. Some really unique relationships with the town of Grenada that the other sites didn't have because they didn't have other towns nearby, which is really cool, and also cool to see that relationship continued into now the Amache Preservation Society and the way that town has really rallied around its establishment as a national park.
Is that unique to Amache among the other?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
They also worked a lot of the farms, the farmers they wouldn't work with them too.
Yeah, so people were able to get leave to go work on farms across Colorado to help with like the harvest and stuff like that.
Do you know how the location was selected?
They were looking for places far away from any military installations and close to a railroad. So the final two selections were Grenada and Holyoke. And then they ultimately decided on Grenada.
So I was pleased to hear that they had a Boy Scout troop. Did they participate with other Boy Scout troops in Lamar and Holly?
Not that I have heard.
I mean, there's no other better way of teaching American principles than the Boy Scout program in a nutshell.
Yeah.
And
I haven't heard any stories with Lamar or Holly or any of the other communities nearby. We do have a really powerful statement from a survivor who was in Boy Scouts that when people were being sent to war, the Boy Scouts would lead them with the bugle and drum corps down to the train station and try to make as much noise as they could. And his quote is something along the lines of, we wanted them to make sure they knew it was our boys who were going to fight for them. We've also got some really fun photos of the Boy Scout troops going to Mesa Verde. They were getting some old CCC buildings to be used on site. For some reason, sent a bunch of children to deal with that. But we have all of these really cute photos of them, like in front of the ruins.
Mesa Verde.
Yeah, in front of Mesa Verde. Or the Pueblos, that's what I was looking for. Yeah.
Well, so they were able to travel and
Under like supervision, yeah. It wasn't like free travel by any means, but people were allowed to get like work clearance. We had a lot of people who were able to leave and go east mostly. If they were going to school or they were able to say they found a job to somewhere in the east, like Chicago ended up being a big draw for a lot of people. The borders were a lot more fluid than you might think, but it was definitely still a prison.
yeah. How big were the gardens? You
It
talked about
varied.
them. Are they acreage?
No. So like the one in this photo is kind of a community garden that is, I don't know, like the space of like this section of this room. Most of them were like entryway gardens in front of barracks, or a lot of times we see them around mess halls, especially the mess halls and latrines, because that's the only place that was running water. Anywhere else you would have had to carry it in. But Manzanar in particular is known for having really big gardens, and we didn't see anything like that in Amache.
Were most of them English speaking? Were most of them English speaking?
For the younger generations, yes.
So their school is probably in English.
Yeah, none of the Japanese Americans were allowed to be teachers. They could be like teacher assistants, but all of the teachers were hired by the War Relocation Authority. And strong emphasis on like American values and things like that. Great. Well, if there's no more questions for me, I really wanted to kind of hold some space for some conversation around why places like Amache matters. Does that sound cool to y'all?
Yeah.
Cool. So just a couple of ground rules before we really dive into that. I want to make sure we're respecting everyone's opinions, that we are listening with empathy, we're sharing thoughts honestly, and we're leaving room for everyone to share if they want. But what comes to mind when y'all think of civil liberties, constitutional rights, things like that?
They're imaginary.
Freedoms.
Freedoms, right? Any particular freedoms that you think of?
Well, they're mapped out in the preamble.
Mm-hmm.
The right to talk, the right to printed page, the right to bear arms.
Yeah. Is there any particular civil liberty that feels like the most important to you?
Freedom of speech.
How would you feel if that was taken away from you?
Not gonna happen. Especially as long as the gun laws are still allowed.
Pivot a little bit. How would you feel if something or someone that you trusted betrayed you or failed you? Not great, probably. That's kind of what was happening here, right? We have American citizens who have certain rights. They have the right to, due process. They have the right to speech, and that failed them. We did see some court cases challenging that, and the most famous one is probably Fred Korematsu. he actually evaded the relocation orders for a while, and his case went all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court actually ruled against him and said that these were for military necessity. At the same time, there was another court case going through. Ex parte Indo was the court's name, or the case's name, where she was, challenging that she didn't get due process. Surprising. This happened at the same time. The court case Supreme Court ruled in favor of her. So we have these kind of conflicting cases coming from the Supreme Court. But we see a lot of these kind of broken promises within what the Japanese Americans were promised through the Constitution and what they actually experienced.
I heard a story from my dad, who was in the Korean War, but he said that when Pearl Harbor was bombed, people were just terrified. And that's why that whole part of the country was on that shutdown, because they just knew that they were going to be coming over water to attack the United States.
Yeah, so there was this huge hysteria and fear,
and you didn't know who was good and who wasn't, and so they just rounded everybody up.
Yeah, which is a wonderful segue to my next question. What rights would you be willing to give up in the name of safety?
How's this a conversation?
Because I'm hoping that you will have some of these.
But you're asking all the questions, you're not letting anybody in the audience ask.
You all can ask questions, I'm not stopping you. Yeah.
Could you repeat that question?
Absolutely. What rights would you be willing to give up in the name of safety?
You said what rights or
What rights?
race?
What rights? What?
Oh, okay.
Whatever you feel is a right that you own. What would you be willing to give up in the name of safety?
Historically, Americans are willing to give up quite a lot of them. By example of what happened in World War II, fear is a very powerful thing. The same happened to the Japanese as well. The communications that the normal person could receive back then were very limited. Millions of Japanese nationals in Japan starved to death in support of a war that they had already lost. And it wasn't quite as tragic on the US side, but we were willing to sell out our own citizens.
Yeah.
I think that's a pretty damning sacrifice.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me that after Germany declared war, we didn't do similar things to Germans in America, did we?
Not to this extent, by any means. There were some German nationals and Italian nationals who were pulled into the true internment camps.
Okay.
And I think in a few isolated instances, you did get German Americans and Italian Americans. I think it was mostly Italian Americans because it was the wrong kind of white person, essentially. But they were a little harder to identify as an other, right?
Oh, I see.
Whereas Japanese Americans stand out a lot more.
It was easier to say that they're French or.
Yeah.
Okay.
And we didn't round up whole families, we just took.
As far as I know, yeah.
specific people that we thought might be bad.
Yeah. Versus this was taking anyone who was 1/16 Japanese. They were even taking children who were adopted into white families were taken from them. Yes, ma'am.
What religion are they? And did they have a church on?
Yeah, so it was a mix. You had Buddhists, and there was a Buddhist church, but then you also had just about every variety of Christian. And there was
Shinto, I assume.
Shinto was illegal, I believe.
Oh, really?
But it was some variety of Buddhism.
Because of the government.
Yeah.
Another one of our rights that we're going to sacrifice.
Yes, and then I want to say that there was technically just one church. It was the Grenada Christian Church, but they cycled through the denominations that were preaching. If I'm remembering correctly, I might be wrong on that.
Cause I know when you go to the cemetery, you see money stacked on the tombstones and stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's, there's a lot of Buddhist influence within the cemetery. Part of that is kind of like the paying honor and like not forgetting the people who were there, because that's like a big kind of taboo in Buddhism. There's the lanterns that are there. That's to help kind of like the spirits find their way back between the worlds. So there's a lot of Buddhist influence, but it was not the only religion on site by any means. Do you think civil liberties and human rights are universal? Or, yeah, universal.
Me, globally, or just you mean like we all have like rights that.
Yes. However you want to interpret
I just
that,
wanted to
yeah.
understand.
Yeah, like,
No.
or do you think that should like should we all have these civil rights, these civil liberties?
What would be ideal?
I think we should all be treated equal,
Yeah,
absolutely.
yeah, that's like the whole point of the country, right?
Exactly.
So when we're thinking about sites like Amache, like what role do places like this have in our society today? Why do we care? What is the big why behind
So
it?
that we don't forget.
Yes.
We need to know
remember
about
not to
this.
do it again.
Absolutely.
Same reason you go to see Doc Cal.
Yeah.
So it never happens again. We need to stop isolating a nationality of people. I mean, we do it today.
Yeah.
When we had the COVID, the Asian people were starting to be attacked because they're Asian.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I mean, it's wrong.
One of the big parallels that we'll see the community draw to is the post 9/11 like Muslim hate that a lot
Right,
of
exactly.
Middle Eastern people got, and there's a lot of parallels that the community feels with how that was, all of that went down.
Well, and it's exactly what happened here.
Yeah. So when we're thinking about places like Amache, and it's, to me, really represents this failure to protect our civil liberties, and we have these really lofty ideals of what this country should be and what we should be doing. And this is kind of like one of the ultimate times where we fell short of those ideals.
Who was the president that said that?
Franklin D. Roosevelt.
Okay.
Yeah, it's like his biggest stain on his presidency, right? I think a lot of us remember him as a really positive president, but he has this huge shadow over his presidency with this incarceration story.
When we were speaking earlier, it came to my mind that, isn't it wild though, that these civil liberties weren't just given up by the American people. All the American people really had to do was not stand in opposition to it. It was only 2 or 3, a handful of people that were able to impart these kinds of drastic changes to such a significant portion of the population.
Yeah,
The protections that we believe there don't exist.
Yeah.
They're not real.
yeah. It's one of the questions I didn't ask. I had a whole big list. Is what rights would you be willing to ask others to give up for your safety? And that's kind of what we have happening here, right? It's like we ask a certain part of the population to give up some of their rights so we would feel safe.
At gunpoint.
Yeah.
I think I had read at some place that Eleanor Roosevelt had objected to this situation, but I don't know if that was really true, or...
It wouldn't surprise me.
No, it wouldn't eat me either, but, maybe it wasn't true, maybe somebody just invented a nice tale,
Yeah.
or maybe it really was real.
When you read reports of some of the big names in this experience, you see how much their positions changed. Like, I want to say been a while since I read this. The FDR was actually against it when it was first brought up. But he was then convinced through one of these other people that he had to do this, right? And the head of the Western Defense Council was also initially against it, and then pivoted super hard and was actually like, all Japanese need to be in a camp. I don't care. Every single one. So people's positions shifted a lot pretty quickly
Okay.
through this. So yeah, it wouldn't surprise me at all if she had said, hold up, no, this is not okay.
Do we know if there were any, people that when the authorities came and said you better get out of your house, that the neighbors did anything, or did everybody just watch it happen? Was it like Germany, did they just say, oh yeah, goodbye?
I haven't heard of any stories like that. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. Just means I haven't read it yet. I've only been in this position for like a year or two, so there's still a lot that I have to learn. Side note, my background's in biology, so like wildly outside the scope of this, but yeah, so I'm learning every day. If there is a story like that, I just haven't seen it yet.
To some extent, a lot of it happens so quickly that, well, my mom has told stories of, you know, whole families in the middle of the night just disappearing. And then showing up down here.
I think it's also important to remember just like the general racist feelings that were happening then is a lot of people wanted them out of their neighborhood. They didn't want them there, so it was like a, yay, good, the government's rounding up the people that I don't like, that I'm scared of. I do know there are cases where neighbors would say like, I'll hold on to your things, and actually did it. Because there are a lot of people who said, I hold on to your stuff, and then they sold it or let it fall into disrepair. But those are more of the stories I've heard is, yeah, people saying they're gonna hold on to their stuff and actually following through with that.
That's good.
I think y'all kind of wrapped it up really nicely with our, let's not do this again conversation. So I have no further questions. Yes.
On the property, when they were relocated there and stuff, I think if they owned houses or businesses or something, did they lose them? And who got that, the government or?
A lot of people just had to sell it to, pennies to the dollar for what they paid. There's one actually really interesting story. There was a family in California who had a rice farm, and he was so successful at farming rice, he became known as the Rice King of California. When the forced removals happened, they started to like shut down their farm and do all this stuff, and the government said, no, you're actually a military necessity, you have to keep this going. So they, I think, entrusted it to some white neighbors. They left. When they came back, most of their stuff had been sold off.
There's also those stories that the farms got taken over like that, and the neighbors stepped in.
Yeah.
And when they did get released from Amache and these other camps, they came back to those farms, and those farmers kept that farm in good shape for them.
Yeah. So there's
and gave them the land back.
Yeah, some really great stories like that, but those seem to be few and far between, unfortunately, and almost everyone lost.
There's a lot of good stories about the people and their experiences through the whole thing, what happened before, what happened after. And there's some videos and stuff around about those.
Yeah.
Those incidences too.
Yeah. So there was some, more hopeful stories that came out of all of this, right?
Sorry, how much time did they have when the order went out? So I'm a Japanese person, how much time do I have to pack up?
When they got these exclusion notices?
Yeah.
1 to 2 weeks usually. Yeah. I think it was kind of like a rolling process, right? So I think a lot of people saw the writing on the wall, knew it was coming, and could start ahead of time. But as soon as those started popping up, yeah, you were given a couple weeks. And
Do we have any idea on people who fled the country, Canada or anything like that? Is that
I have not seen any data on that. I think Canada also had a few sites like this.
Oh, interesting.
Not to the extent that we did, and by no means am I an expert on Canadian national history. So I can't verify that, but I do think I read somewhere that Canada also did this to on a smaller scale.
So it wasn't necessarily a safe place either.
Yeah. There's also some very confusing, at least for me, stories coming out of Latin America, where there were Japanese immigrants to like Latin and South America that were then, I think, pulled into the US and kept as like a prisoner, and they didn't get a lot of the same protections, and like, it's a really weird, convoluted history, but yeah, there's something with like Japanese people in like south of the US that has something to do with this as well. I don't know.
The Japanese that were in Hawaii,
Mhm.
was there a camp that they just left to?
They were put under martial law for, I think, all of the time. But there was such a huge population of Japanese people in Hawaii that it would have crashed the economy of the Hawaiian Islands to remove them all. So there were some camps in Hawaii. Honolulu is the one within the Park Service. And I believe it was run by the Army. But it's, yeah, kind of separate from this experience. Like, shared to some extent, but outside of what the War Relocation Authority was doing.
I may have, I'm very hard of hearing, so I may be repeating some of the things that have already been discussed, but my knowledge is the government figured out that the Japanese were very honest to this country. I mean, when they came, they gave Japanese away, and they regretted kind of putting these Japanese in these camps years later, because they found out how true the Japanese were to this country.
Yeah.
And through the Japanese is kind of what won the war, because we had Japanese interpreters listening
Yeah.
to the Japanese, and what really won the war was the Indians. They used the code.
Oh, the
talkers.
Navajo code talkers, yeah,
Yes.
yeah.
And the Japanese could never figure out exactly what the US was doing. So the Japanese played a major part in.
Absolutely, yeah.
You know, so.
Something I failed to mention when I was talking about the 442 is that combined with the 100th Infantry Battalion, which was another segregated unit, it is the most decorated unit in U.S. military history for its size and length of service. So they were a huge part of World War II. And then, yeah, you throw in like the military intelligence service. There was a language school in Boulder to train people in Japanese to help decode stuff. Yeah, they played a huge part in winning that war.
Okay.
Any other questions? You had a question.
Well, I was just curious, if somebody was, Japanese ancestry was already in the service, did they, and then this happened, did they take them out of that and put them into that special branch?
I think so. I feel like I've read something, but I can't remember the actual answer right now.
We'll go with yes.
But they served in Germany though, right?
Germany, Italy,
Italy, Africa.
some portion of the 442 was actually part of, they didn't liberate like the actual camp of Dachau, but there was Dachau. The Germans were marching prisoners from Dachau, and they came across that and were able to liberate those people. So there's some ties to like the liberation of the concentration camps with Japanese American units.
What I found so interesting was the amount of people that were down there, like 7,000, 74
At Amache,
at Amache?
7,500-ish.
7,500, yeah, and upwards to 10,000. Man, that's a lot.
Yeah.
That's a lot.
And that's the smallest out of all the sites. The largest, I believe, was Tule Lake
Wow.
in California, and it, at its peak, I think, had 18,000.
Wow.
It was 120,000 Japanese Americans total. Over 120,000. So, unless people's families, you know, never lived on the West Coast or immigrated after World War II, it's kind of hard to find someone who isn't touched by this story within the community. At least I found, like, someone's got, you know, a grandparent, an aunt, an uncle of so-and-so who was at one of these sites.
There was a minister here in Rocky Ford. He went to the Disciples of Christ Church, and he taught English to the Japanese folks around there. Do you remember his name?
Was it Sakamoto?
Yes, Reverend Sakamoto.
Yeah, I heard about him. And, yeah, he, but that was after World War II, I believe, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. But he played a big part in the Rocky Ford area,
Oh, yeah.
teaching Japanese folks how to speak English.
I don't think that he was ever at Machi,
Sakamoto.
Um,
No, he wasn't, but.
but he did teach, yeah.
Because of the voluntary evacuation period, and a lot of the people who immigrated from Japan were farmers. Agriculture was a really big industry within Japanese Americans. And agriculture is such a big, you know, thing out here. You did see a pretty large influx of Japanese people to Colorado, and not just like the Denver, Boulder area. Oddly enough, a family friend of mine, or my parents really, their son is like a couple years younger than me. They have Japanese ancestry. The son, who's around my age, his grandmother is from Lamar, Japanese, but not because of Amache. Her family was here, presumably, yeah, farming.
Or railroad.
Yeah, or railroad.
Actually, most of the Japanese in this area are not here from Amache.
Yeah.
No.
Talked to some of the Japanese here. They were actually established in farming here, and they never ever were rounded up and put into the camp.
Yeah.
Their families have been in this valley for years and years.
Well, my grandparents taught at Grand Valley, outside of Rocky Ford before the war, and there was a fairly large Japanese, population at that point, because I've heard stories from him of, you know, my mother learning how to eat with chopsticks, for instance, or whatever, or a tea service that was given to him, and that was all prior to World War II.
Okay, yeah.
It would have been like late 30s, early, you know, probably late 30s.
Yeah. Interesting, yeah.
What was all of the people on that section of the continent that were interned, right?
Yeah, so it was only that exclusion zone. If you were
Already here.
which must have been so weird for the Japanese population who's already in Colorado to then have this captive group of Japanese Americans, you know, just down the road from you, while you're able to walk freely. Like, I don't know, it's just a really odd juxtaposition of.
Growing up here though, I mean, I just assumed most of the Japanese settled after, but no, like I say, you talk to most of the Japanese in this area, they were here and they never were at the camps.
Right.
Because of the sugar beet industry.
Yeah.
See, I think there were a handful
1901 to 1906 or so.
who,
That's what Chuck said.
And, so.
I know there were a handful that left Amache, and like because they had worked, you know, harvest with farmers, were able to get jobs in the more local area. But I think a lot of them, either went to Denver, went east, or went back to California.
That was another thing, I mean, the government put the Japanese at Amache, they thought it was worthless land, just like they've done with the Indians. And they proved that they could take a piece of what the government thought was completely non-productive property.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And they, like you say, provided food for the country.
Something that was shared with me is that a lot of the immigrants who were coming from Japan, that was because the land they had in Japan was super poor. So then they get to, especially like California, and the poor land that was left in California is still like worlds better than what was in Japan. So they had all these really great farming techniques they brought with them from Japan, and then could apply it to places like California, like Amache, and especially coming out of the Dust Bowl.
Yeah.
And yeah, Amache was also the only site that was built on private land. All of the other was public land that was grabbed for these sites, but they condemned a ranch, bought it for really, really cheap because, yeah, Dust Bowl prices,
Right, okay.
and turned it into an incarceration site.
Quite the history, quite the history.
It's,
I want to say thank you for coming out and sharing.
oh, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
this
you.
is great. Thank y'all for having me.
Thank you, Julianna.
Yeah, no problem.
Just be very careful when you're walking out on the ice. It's very slick out there, probably 5 degrees above zero. So
Don't remind me. We'll find out.
so be very careful. Be very careful.
Can we stand here till it warms up?
Yeah.
And our next talk is going to be Beth Dodd, who's going to be talking about the Sand Creek Massacre. And that's going to be coming April. So we'll get that stuff posted.
Did you have a date on that?
Don't have a date. Do we have a date on that? I want to say April the 10th,
Okay.
I think. But don't hold me to it. It's either 9th or 10th, somewhere in there.
Okay.
Went too far. I was going to go back to that resources slide. If you are interested in visiting Amache, I should mention this. The museum is currently open from Monday through Friday from 8 to 4 p.m. And then the site itself is open 7 days a week, sunrise to sunset. That being said, there's no gates, but like, please be responsible. I'm hopeful that we might be able to start offering some programming over the summer that will be posted on our website and our Facebook page if we are able to get that going. So if you're interested in coming to hear me talk to you more about this, keep an eye out there.
Great.
And then I lied, I do have one more question. Where can I get dinner?
Fiesta Cafe.
Fiesta Cafe?
Fiesta closes at 8, don't they? Or do they?
I'd say Boss Hogs. Don't you say Boss Hogs?